So as we just learned in the previous video, before we read this article, we want to preview the information so that we know what to look for. So we can scroll down and read through the following questions. Task: answer the following questions. What is the benefit of forgetting information? What is the name of the system in our brain that controls what we focus on and if we remember or forget? And finally, how long should we wait before reviewing or testing ourselves for the first time after learning something to prevent ourselves from forgetting? Now that we know what to look for, let's read the article. The forgetting curve maps out the natural process of forgetting, and this process of forgetting can be prevented. People forget much of what they have learned almost immediately following an experience. Let us use names for an example. Look at the following names for a minute and remember as many of them as possible. Juliet, Conchobar, Stefan, Belshazzar, Saga, Dwayne, Wazel, Porfirio, Sebastian, Danielle. We will revisit these names later, but for now, remember as many as you can, repeat them if you need, and then let us keep reading. Forgetting is something that humans have evolved to do for our benefit, even if it at times is annoying and not helpful for things like school. But forgetting information can help improve the flexibility of the brain by removing outdated and unnecessary information. Speaking of unnecessary information, your brain is highly capable of listening to multiple conversations at once, but we have evolved to have this amazing filter that helps us block out unwanted voices in conversations, and it's called the reticular activating system, otherwise known as the RAS, Reticular Activating System. And it helps you decide what you're able to focus on and then what you should ignore. And thank goodness we have this. Think of how overwhelming it would be to be in a crowded room like a cafeteria or auditorium where your brain would remember every conversation permanently. Your brain would fill up with these pointless conversations and information, and you'd be helpless to sort through all of this information. You'd have information overload, and you'd be spending all your time trying to figure out what was actually important. But your reticular activating system helps us so we don't have to actively do this. So because of this filter, we do, however, need to learn how to convince our brain that what we have learned is necessary so it is not forgotten. So let's learn how to tell our reticular activating system what it should remember. And in order to understand that, let's take a look at the following charts. So how do we forget? So we have the forgetting curve over here, as we saw in our previous lesson. So at 100% information, the forgetting curve would start here if we could remember everything after a lesson. Unfortunately, we don't have perfect recall, so it's more likely that we're starting a little below 80% at the end. So below 80%, the forgetting curve would actually start here, as typically we only remember about 75% at the end of a lecture or lesson, so we have less to remember. Then, this red line over here, you have the potential to forget less, plus remember more if you study immediately after class. So if we take a look at this red line, if we repeat the testing, this will help us beat the forgetting curve to remember all of that information. So let's take a look at what all this means. So this green line represents that fake scenario, as we just mentioned over here, and we will not walk away remembering every single word and piece of information. We know that's not realistic, so we have the blue line, which is assuming you remember most things up to 75% over here, because it's still fresh in our minds, but not everything. You'll notice I'm saying this again to repeat the information for you. Then we can see on the x-axis over here, where time has passed, we have over here 10 minutes, 24 hours, 1 week, and 1 month. And we also can see on the y-axis, this is the percent of information remembered. So looking at the different lines, we can see that both the green and the blue lines start fairly high. But after 10 minutes, the percentages drop from 100% to 75%, so here to here. And then from 75 to 55%, here to here on the blue line. So if we continue to look at the data point after 24 hours, we can see both these data points are below 50%. In other words, after 24 hours of learning something for the first time, on average, we don't even remember 50% of what we've learned. So knowing this and using this information, we can figure out that our brains will forget a lot of information between 8 to 24 hours after learning something. And we can also see that looking at the red line, the amount of information we forget is much less after 24 hours because we've already forgotten most of the information. So looking at the graph, we can see this part of the graph we don't forget as much information as opposed to in this part, which is the immediate part. So what can we conclude from this information? We learn that testing ourselves in this window forces the brain to try and recall this information, which signals the reticular activating system. A little flag goes up inside because we're trying to remember the information, and the brain realizes that this might be something kind of important, that maybe I should flag this to be put into long-term memory. And the more we test ourselves on specific information, the more our reticular activating system tells our brain to remember it. Because the act of testing ourselves and then the retrieval process of recalling that information tells our brain that it's an important information. And as it is said, repetition is the mother of learning, and repeated testing of the important information helps lock it into long-term memory. In summary, using this information, we learn that we should review that information with specific techniques. Reviewing and testing that information 8 to 24 hours after class has ended will help prevent some of the forgetting. But this is still not good enough for the reticular activating system to remember something long term. It requires much more repetition. But how much? We will find out in the next section. So now you guys are ready to answer the following questions. What is the benefit of forgetting information? What is the name of the system in our brain that controls what we focus on and if we remember or forget? And how long should we wait before reviewing and testing ourselves for the first time after learning something to prevent ourselves from forgetting? And I will see you guys in the next section.